9 million artillery shells moved from North Korea to Russia within roughly 6 months. That number alone explains why this war has not stalled the way many analysts predicted, and it opens a chain of consequences that reaches far beyond the front line in Ukraine. Those shells did not simply reinforce Russian artillery positions. They signaled a deeper alliance forming quietly between Moscow and Pyongyang. A relationship that many governments once dismissed as symbolic suddenly became operational on a real battlefield. Ammunition shipments became troop deployments became battlefield casualties, and those casualties are now reshaping military calculations across Europe and East Asia simultaneously. Picture the scene intelligence agencies began tracking in late 2024. Cargo ships leaving North Korean ports at night, loaded with containers labeled as industrial supplies. Rail lines inside Russia receiving shipments that Western intelligence later linked to artillery stockpiles. And somewhere inside that flow of equipment came something more significant than ammunition: human manpower. Thousands of North Korean soldiers transported across thousands of kilometers to reinforce Russian positions near the Kursk region. That deployment changed the geometry of this war more than many headlines ever acknowledged. But the surface explanation never told the full story. Russia did not turn to North Korea simply because it wanted extra troops. Moscow turned to Pyongyang because the war had entered a phase defined by industrial endurance. Ukraine's allies supplied advanced weapon systems and intelligence networks. Russia responded by leaning heavily on mass artillery doctrine developed during the Soviet era. That doctrine requires overwhelming ammunition volume to suppress enemy movement. When artillery fires 10 rounds per minute across hundreds of guns, stockpiles disappear quickly. North Korea happened to possess one of the world's largest reserves of Soviet-compatible artillery shells. That was the first layer. The deeper layer was manpower. Russia's mobilization system relies on a mixture of professional soldiers, volunteers, and conscripts. But domestic political pressure inside Russia complicates large-scale conscription waves. Losses during prolonged offensives have repeatedly forced the Kremlin to look for alternative manpower solutions. Private military companies filled part of that gap earlier in the war. Foreign recruits from Central Asia appeared in limited numbers, yet none of those options solved the structural shortage of trained infantry available for sustained frontline rotations. That shortage created an opening for North Korea. North Korea maintains one of the largest standing armies in the world, with roughly 1.2 to 1.3 million active personnel. On paper, those numbers suggest overwhelming strength. In reality, much of that force operates with outdated equipment and limited combat experience. The Korean Peninsula has not seen large-scale war since the armistice of 1953. Training occurs constantly, but real battlefield exposure has been absent for decades. For military planners in Pyongyang, the Ukraine conflict suddenly presented something extremely rare: a live testing ground for modern warfare. This is where the alliance began to evolve beyond ammunition shipments. According to widely reported intelligence assessments during late 2024 and early 2025, thousands of North Korean troops were transferred into Russian territory. Most were reportedly positioned near the Kursk region rather than deep inside Ukraine itself. The distinction mattered politically because Russia could claim it was defending its own territory. It also allowed Moscow to frame the deployment as cooperation under bilateral defense agreements. But on the battlefield, the distinction meant little. Those soldiers entered an environment dominated by drones, precision artillery, and constant surveillance. The adjustment was brutal. Reports from Western and Ukrainian officials suggested that early casualty rates among those deployed units were extremely high. Drone warfare alone has transformed infantry survival on modern battlefields. Small unmanned aircraft can detect troop movement within minutes. Precision artillery can then target those coordinates almost immediately. Units trained primarily under older doctrines suddenly faced a battlefield where exposure lasted seconds rather than minutes. That learning curve produced heavy losses during the first months of deployment, and yet something else happened simultaneously. North Korean units began adapting. Ukrainian soldiers interviewed by international media described changes in tactics after the first wave of encounters. Formations shifted, movement patterns adjusted to avoid drone detection. Some units began coordinating more closely with Russian artillery support. Those adjustments suggested that even limited battlefield exposure was rapidly reshaping how those soldiers operated. Military analysts watching this development realized something important. North Korea was not simply exporting manpower, it was importing modern combat experience. That realization carries implications far beyond Ukraine. Because every soldier who survives such a deployment returns with knowledge unavailable anywhere inside North Korea's training system. Knowledge about drones, electronic warfare, modern artillery coordination, and real battlefield logistics. Those lessons could reshape military doctrine across the Korean Peninsula for years. South Korean defense planners are acutely aware of this possibility. Seoul's military already maintains technological superiority in many areas, but battlefield experience can change the equation faster than technology alone. Let that sit. And there was another layer quietly unfolding beneath the battlefield story: financial incentives. Reports from international observers suggested that Russia compensates the North Korean government for deployed personnel. Exact numbers remain difficult to verify publicly, but widely reported estimates suggest the arrangement may involve hundreds of millions of dollars annually. For Pyongyang, that revenue arrives alongside food shipments and potential access to military technology cooperation. For individual soldiers, the incentives look different. Even a small fraction of those payments reaching troops could represent significant income compared to typical North Korean living standards. That incentive structure matters more than it first appears, because it creates motivation inside a system normally defined by strict state control rather than personal choice. A soldier who spends a year abroad and returns with savings gains social status at home. Families benefit materially in ways that domestic military service rarely provides. Those dynamics may quietly encourage participation despite the risks. At the same time, the North Korean state reportedly maintains close supervision over deployed units to prevent defections or unsanctioned contact with foreign populations. The psychological tension inside those deployments must be extraordinary. Now step back and consider the broader strategic picture emerging from these events. Russia gains artillery ammunition and additional manpower for defensive operations near its own borders. North Korea gains battlefield experience, financial resources, and deeper military ties with a major power. Ukraine gains intelligence insights from captured equipment and occasional prisoners. Western governments gain evidence that the war is expanding into a wider geopolitical alignment. None of these outcomes existed at the beginning of the conflict in 2022. And that is where the next question begins forming. The next major data release about troop movements is expected soon. Based on everything you have heard so far, what do you think it shows? Because if the numbers continue rising, the consequences will not stay confined to one battlefield. Those troop numbers matter because they reveal whether the alliance between Moscow and Pyongyang is temporary or becoming structural. Early intelligence assessments suggested roughly 10,000 North Korean soldiers rotated into Russian territory during the first deployment wave. At first glance, that figure looks small compared with the scale of the war, but the strategic signal was never about the raw number of soldiers. The signal was that Russia was willing to integrate a foreign army into its operational environment. That decision crossed a psychological threshold many governments had assumed Moscow would avoid. Picture the logistical challenge behind that move. Thousands of soldiers traveling thousands of kilometers across rail networks that stretch from East Asia into Western Russia. Different languages, different command structures, and different training systems suddenly forced to operate together under battlefield pressure. Russian officers reportedly had to rely on interpreters embedded within units to relay commands. Coordination delays on a modern battlefield can mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. Yet those units still began appearing in areas where Russian forces needed reinforcement most urgently. The Kursk region became the focal point of that pressure. When Ukrainian forces conducted cross-border operations in 2024, the event shocked Russian military planners more than many observers realized. The symbolic impact mattered almost as much as the military impact. For the first time since the full-scale invasion began, Ukrainian troops briefly controlled sections of Russian territory itself. Even limited territorial incursions forced the Kremlin to demonstrate that it could defend its own border regions. Political credibility inside Russia suddenly depended on restoring control quickly. That urgency changed the manpower equation overnight. Russia could not easily redeploy every frontline unit from Ukraine without risking other sectors collapsing. At the same time, mobilizing new conscript waves carried domestic political costs. North Korean troops therefore appeared at a moment when Russia needed additional manpower for defensive stabilization rather than large offensive pushes. Their presence allowed Russian commanders to redistribute other units toward more critical sectors along the broader front. But the battlefield did not pause to accommodate coordination challenges. Modern warfare in Ukraine moves at a tempo shaped by drones and real-time intelligence feeds. Small quadcopters hover above trenches scanning for movement. Artillery units receive targeting data within minutes. Precision-guided munitions arrive shortly afterward. Infantry formations trained under older doctrines suddenly face a battlefield where concealment and electronic warfare determine survival. North Korean units entering that environment encountered an operational reality very different from traditional training exercises. Casualty reports began surfacing quickly. Western intelligence officials and Ukrainian sources both suggested that a significant portion of the initial North Korean contingent suffered casualties within the first months. Exact figures remain difficult to confirm publicly because both Russia and North Korea restrict information tightly. But estimates circulating through international reporting indicated thousands killed or wounded during early engagements. The losses reflected not only combat intensity but also the steep learning curve imposed by modern drone warfare. And yet the deployment continued. Additional rotations reportedly followed during early 2025, suggesting that both governments viewed the arrangement as worthwhile despite the human cost. Reinforcements arrived through cargo aircraft and maritime transport routes linking North Korean ports with Russian logistics hubs. Each new rotation expanded the scale of cooperation between two militaries that previously interacted mostly through arms transfers rather than joint operations. But that is still only the visible layer. Behind the battlefield headlines sits a financial architecture shaping the entire partnership. Russia gains ammunition production capacity that its domestic industry struggles to match during prolonged war. North Korea gains access to energy supplies, food shipments, and foreign currency revenues. Reports have indicated that large quantities of rice shipments accompanied military cooperation agreements. For a country facing chronic food shortages, such deliveries represent strategic leverage. The economic dimension explains why this partnership has persisted despite international sanctions. Sanctions aim to restrict North Korea's access to global financial networks, but bilateral exchanges conducted through state-controlled channels can bypass many of those restrictions. Barter arrangements involving commodities, military equipment, and energy supplies operate outside conventional financial systems. That mechanism allows cooperation to expand even when formal banking channels remain blocked by sanctions regimes, and the strategic benefits extend beyond economics. North Korean military planners now observe one of the most technologically intense conflicts of the 21st century from inside the operational environment itself. They can watch how drones locate artillery positions. They can study how electronic jamming disrupts communications. They can observe how modern anti-armor weapons defeat traditional tank formations. Every one of those lessons feeds directly into future military planning back on the Korean Peninsula. This is where the geopolitical shock begins spreading outward. South Korea monitors these developments with intense concern because battlefield experience cannot be replicated easily through training simulations. A soldier who survives combat returns home with instincts shaped by real engagements rather than theoretical exercises. If even a fraction of deployed troops return to North Korea with first-hand experience fighting drone-supported warfare, that knowledge could influence tactical doctrine across the peninsula. And the ripple effect does not stop there. Japan and other regional allies also track these developments carefully. The Korean Peninsula already sits inside one of the most militarized regions on Earth. Any improvement in North Korea's operational capabilities complicates the strategic balance across Northeast Asia. Defense planners must consider how lessons learned in Eastern Europe might eventually appear in a completely different theater. Read that again. The same war reshaping Europe's security architecture is simultaneously altering military dynamics in East Asia. That realization forces analysts to ask a deeper question about the long-term structure of this alliance. Russia gains manpower and ammunition today, but it also transfers military knowledge indirectly through shared operations. North Korea gains battlefield experience today, but it also becomes more deeply tied to Russian strategic interests. Over time, those incentives could transform a temporary wartime partnership into something more durable. And that possibility introduces a contradiction that few governments publicly acknowledge. Russia insists that foreign troops operate only on Russian territory for defensive purposes. At the same time, Ukrainian officials argue that those deployments effectively support Russian offensive operations by freeing other units for combat elsewhere. Both narratives circulate simultaneously through international media coverage. Both cannot be completely accurate at the same time. So which version reflects the reality unfolding on the ground? Because if the partnership continues expanding, the next stage of this war may look very different from the first. That contradiction becomes impossible to ignore once the intelligence picture expands beyond the battlefield itself. Analysts began noticing a different pattern emerging at the same time troop rotations were increasing. Russian logistics hubs in the Far Eastern region started handling unusually large volumes of military freight moving west. Rail networks connecting Vladivostok to central Russia carried shipments that Western monitoring groups later linked to artillery supplies and equipment transfers. Those movements indicated something more organized than emergency wartime cooperation. It looked like a supply corridor. A corridor stretching thousands of kilometers between two heavily sanctioned states that both needed resources the other could provide. Russia required ammunition stockpiles large enough to sustain prolonged artillery warfare. North Korea required food supplies, energy shipments, and hard currency revenues. When those needs intersected, geography provided a direct solution. Rail lines and cargo ships quietly connected two isolated economies into a functioning wartime supply chain. But supply chains have consequences far beyond logistics. Every artillery shell delivered through that corridor influences the pace of combat along the front lines. Artillery remains one of the defining features of this war because it shapes how territory changes hands. Heavy bombardment suppresses troop movement, limits counteroffensives, and forces opposing forces to disperse across wider areas. When one side maintains steady ammunition flow, it gains the ability to control tempo even without dramatic territorial breakthroughs. That tempo control is exactly what Russia needed. The war's early months were dominated by rapid maneuvers and large mechanized pushes. Over time, the battlefield evolved into something closer to an industrial attrition contest. Trench systems expanded across hundreds of kilometers. Drone surveillance reduced the effectiveness of large armored assaults. Artillery and precision strikes gradually became the dominant instruments shaping daily combat outcomes. Sustaining that environment requires extraordinary quantities of ammunition. This is where the earlier number comes back into focus. 9 million artillery shells is not simply a large shipment. It represents months of sustained bombardment capacity under certain firing rates. Even if actual deliveries fluctuate across different estimates, the scale remains enormous compared with the production capacity of many countries. That volume of ammunition can keep artillery brigades active for extended periods without forcing immediate domestic manufacturing expansion. That number is not a typo, and it reveals why North Korea suddenly became such a valuable partner for Moscow. For decades, North Korea invested heavily in artillery systems designed to threaten South Korea across the demilitarized zone. Maintaining that deterrent required vast ammunition reserves stored in hardened facilities. Those stockpiles now function as a strategic export commodity. What once existed primarily for deterrence has become an asset traded into a completely different conflict thousands of kilometers away. But ammunition is only one side of the exchange. The other side involves technological exposure. North Korean troops operating alongside Russian forces gain access to battlefield environments filled with modern equipment. Electronic warfare systems, advanced drones, counter-battery radar, satellite reconnaissance, and precision-guided munitions all operate simultaneously within the conflict zone. Even indirect observation of these systems offers insight unavailable inside North Korea's domestic training infrastructure. Picture the moment from a soldier's perspective. You arrive in a foreign country where drones buzz constantly overhead. Artillery arrives with terrifying speed after detection. Communications depend on encrypted radios and electronic countermeasures. Every movement risks immediate observation by aerial surveillance. The battlefield environment forces rapid adaptation because mistakes are punished instantly. That experience rewires how soldiers think about combat. Military historians often note that wars accelerate learning curves faster than any training program. Tactical adjustments that might take years during peacetime occur within weeks during active combat. Units experiment, fail, adapt, and repeat under constant pressure. Even partial participation in such an environment can reshape military doctrine once those lessons travel back home. This is exactly why South Korean defense planners watch the situation so closely. South Korea maintains one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the region. Precision strike capabilities, modern air power, and advanced surveillance systems give Seoul significant advantages. Yet military planners also understand that battlefield experience can narrow gaps faster than technology alone. Soldiers who have faced drone swarms and electronic warfare in real combat will approach future conflicts differently, and those lessons may already be spreading. Reports from international analysts suggest that North Korean forces began adjusting their battlefield behavior after the earliest encounters in Ukraine. Movement patterns shifted towards smaller dispersed units. Coordination with artillery support improved over time. Defensive positioning evolved to reduce vulnerability to aerial surveillance. Each adaptation indicates a learning process unfolding under real combat conditions. But that adaptation came at extraordinary cost. Estimates circulating through public reporting suggested that roughly a third of the original North Korean contingent may have been killed or wounded during early operations. Even if exact figures remain uncertain, the losses appear substantial relative to the size of the initial deployment. Those casualties highlight how unforgiving modern battlefields have become for units entering without prior exposure to drone warfare. If you notice these signals early, how long ago did you start watching this shift develop? Because analysts tracking logistics flows had already flagged unusual activity months before troop deployments became widely reported. Satellite imagery revealed shipping patterns increasing between North Korean ports and Russian facilities. Intelligence agencies began discussing artillery supply transfers long before battlefield encounters confirmed the presence of North Korean personnel. Those signals formed a pattern suggesting that the partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang was evolving steadily rather than appearing suddenly. What began as ammunition shipments gradually expanded into personnel deployments. What began as quiet logistics cooperation slowly transformed into a battlefield relationship carrying strategic consequences across multiple regions. And there was still one detail hidden near the beginning of this story. Remember those interpreters embedded within military units to bridge language barriers? At first, that looked like a minor logistical note. Communication support is routine whenever multinational forces operate together. Yet that small detail hints at something larger happening behind the scenes. Because interpreters are not deployed for temporary contact. They are deployed when two militaries expect to operate together long enough that communication becomes operationally critical. Those interpreters reveal how deeply the cooperation had already progressed by the time the first casualties appeared. Military planners partners do not build translation networks for brief symbolic deployments. They build them when they expect units to coordinate under real operational pressure for extended periods. That requirement alone suggests the partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang had moved well beyond the level of simple ammunition transfers. It had entered the territory of structured military coordination. And once that threshold is crossed, alliances rarely shrink quickly. The consequences extend far beyond the battlefield in Ukraine. When foreign troops appear in a European war, every major power begins recalculating strategic risk. NATO governments interpreted the North Korean deployment as evidence that Russia was willing to internationalize the conflict indirectly. The response from Western capitals accelerated military aid decisions that had already been under debate. Long-range missile approvals, expanded training programs, and new weapons packages followed in the months after reports of the deployment became widely known. Each step raised the intensity of the broader geopolitical competition surrounding the war. At the same moment, another strategic actor faced a complicated dilemma. China maintains a delicate balancing act in relation to the conflict. Beijing benefits economically from access to Russian energy resources and trade links. At the same time, Chinese leaders prefer avoiding direct association with an expanding military alliance involving heavily sanctioned states. The arrival of North Korean troops into the Russian war effort created an uncomfortable optic for Chinese diplomacy. It linked two of Beijing's neighbors in a conflict that already strained global economic stability. Picture the calculation inside a foreign ministry late at night. You are reviewing intelligence briefings describing troop deployments, supply corridors, and expanding military cooperation between two governments already facing sanctions. At the same time, your own economy depends on global trade stability and functioning supply chains. Any escalation that widens the war could disrupt those networks dramatically, yet distancing yourself too openly from one partner risks weakening strategic relationships that matter elsewhere. Every decision carries consequences that ripple far beyond one region. That strategic balancing act continues today. Meanwhile, the battlefield itself keeps evolving faster than diplomatic discussions can keep up. Drone production accelerates on both sides of the conflict. Electronic warfare systems appear in larger numbers across the front. Artillery duels continue shaping territorial control day after day. Within that environment, every additional soldier and every additional ammunition shipment alters the tactical equation slightly. The war grinds forward through incremental adjustments rather than sudden breakthroughs. But the deeper structural question remains unresolved. If North Korea can send 10,000 soldiers once, the theoretical ceiling is far higher. Public estimates of North Korea's reserve manpower suggest the country could deploy significantly larger contingents if political leadership decided the benefits outweighed the risks. Ukrainian intelligence officials have publicly speculated about the possibility of tens of thousands more troops appearing in future rotations. Even partial increases would shift the manpower calculations surrounding Russian defensive operations. Both narratives now circulate through international analysis. One interpretation argues that the deployment will remain limited because casualties and logistical complications make larger commitments unlikely. The other interpretation suggests the partnership will deepen as long as both governments continue gaining tangible benefits. Each side presents evidence supporting its view. Casualty figures imply caution, while continued supply shipments imply persistence. Both cannot be true indefinitely. Which interpretation matches the pattern you are actually seeing unfold? Because the early warning signs of deeper cooperation were visible long before most headlines noticed them. Rail traffic patterns across eastern Russia increased months before troop deployments were confirmed. Cargo ship routes between North Korean ports and Russian terminals expanded steadily during the same period. Those movements suggested planning cycles measured in months rather than emergency reactions measured in days. That is where the earlier interpreter detail becomes more significant. Translation teams embedded in military structures are not temporary accessories. They represent institutional preparation for sustained joint operations. Once command structures integrate communication systems, operational coordination becomes easier over time rather than harder. Future rotations require fewer adjustments because the infrastructure already exists. Now connect that reality back to the original number. 9 million artillery shells moved through this emerging partnership during the early phase of cooperation. That shipment helped sustain Russia's artillery advantage during a period when ammunition consumption rates were extremely high. It also revealed how effectively two sanctioned states could build a wartime supply relationship outside conventional financial networks. The number that opened this story now echoes through its final layer. Because the real vulnerability in the global system is not simply the battlefield alliance itself, the vulnerability is how quickly new military partnerships can form when two governments share incentives strong enough to overcome isolation. Once that mechanism activates, it can redraw geopolitical alignments faster than diplomatic institutions can react. And the next development is already forming somewhere along that corridor of rail lines and cargo ships. More shipments could appear, more troops could rotate into training areas near the Russian border, more lessons from modern warfare could travel back toward the Korean peninsula carried by soldiers who experienced them firsthand. The next intelligence report will reveal which direction this partnership is actually moving. What happens if the numbers are larger next time?